In a land far away, nestled between the borders of Uz, there lived a man named Job, a man whose name has become synonymous with suffering and unwavering faith. But who was Job? Why does his story, written thousands of years ago, still resonate so powerfully with us today? What secrets lie in the life of this man who seemed to have everything, only to lose it all in the blink of an eye? Let me take you back to a time when wealth wasn't counted in bank accounts but in herds and flocks, when a person's stature was measured by the size of their family and their unwavering dedication to the divine. Job was not just wealthy, he was among the wealthiest men of his time. Imagine a man with 7,000 sheep grazing on lush green pastures, 3,000 camels trudging through the deserts, 500 pairs of oxen plowing fields, and 500 donkeys braying in the stables. Add to that a household bustling with servants and laughter, and a family of 7 sons and 3 daughters who gathered for joyous feasts. But Job wasn't just a man of riches. He was a man of righteousness. He was known far and wide for his integrity, his fear of God, and his commitment to shun evil. His life wasn't merely about accumulating wealth or celebrating success. It was about ensuring the spiritual well-being of his household. Picture this. After every feast his children held, Job would rise early in the morning to offer sacrifices to God on their behalf. He'd think, what if they've sinned in their hearts, even unknowingly? Such was his devotion not only to God but to his family. He wasn't just a father. He was a spiritual guardian, standing in the gap between his children and divine judgment. But here's a question. How does a man like this, faithful, devoted, and upright, find himself in the midst of unimaginable suffering? Could it happen to anyone? Could it happen to us? Before we unravel the tragedies that befell Job, let's pause for a moment to reflect. Have you ever felt like your life was finally falling into place, only to have it all come crashing down? Or wondered why bad things happen to good people? Perhaps the story of Job holds the answers, or at least the wisdom to guide us through life's darkest valleys. And so, Job's story begins. A tale not just of prosperity but of trials that would test the very foundations of his faith. Stay with me, because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about life, suffering, and the mysterious ways of God. Job's life, as prosperous and blessed as it was, would soon take a turn so devastating that it would leave even the strongest of men utterly broken. Little did Job know that while he was faithfully offering sacrifices and living a life of integrity, an unseen cosmic conversation was unfolding, a conversation that would forever alter his destiny. In the courts of heaven, Satan appeared before God, and a bold accusation was made. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household? Take everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. With that, the stage was set for a series of trials that would strip Job of everything he held dear. It began abruptly, like a thunderclap on a sunny day. A messenger arrived at Job's doorstep, his face pale with terror. The Sabaeans have attacked. They stole the oxen and donkeys and killed all the servants tending them. I alone escaped to tell you. Before Job could process the shock, another messenger ran in, his voice trembling with urgency. Fire from the heavens fell and burned up the sheep and the servants with them. I alone escaped to tell you. But it didn't end there. A third messenger rushed in, breathless and frantic. The Chaldeans formed raiding parties. They took the camels and slaughtered more of your servants. I alone escaped to tell you. Job, reeling from the cascade of losses, was dealt one final crushing blow. A fourth messenger staggered through the doorway, his eyes filled with sorrow. Your sons and daughters. They were feasting together when a mighty wind swept in from the desert. It struck the house and it collapsed on them. They are all dead. I alone escaped to tell you. Can you imagine the weight of these words? Within moments, Job's wealth, security, and even his beloved children were gone. The vibrant life he had built, the family he had cherished, and the blessings he had stewarded, obliterated in an instant. How would you respond to such a calamity? Would you cry out in anger? Would you question why a just God would allow such pain? Job's reaction was profound and hauntingly beautiful. In the midst of his anguish, he tore his robe, a symbol of his deep mourning. He shaved his head, a gesture of utter humility and despair. Then he fell to the ground, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in worship. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Even as his world crumbled, Job refused to sin or charge God with wrongdoing. But why? How could a man, so deeply wounded, still bow before the Creator with reverence? Was it blind faith, or did Job understand something about God that we often forget in our darkest hours? And so, the tragedy of Job unfolds, a tale not just of loss, but of a faith that stands firm in the face of unimaginable sorrow. But this is only the beginning. What comes next will delve deeper into the physical and emotional agony Job endured, and the questions that emerged from his suffering. Stay with me as we uncover the layers of this extraordinary story. As if the loss of his wealth and children wasn't enough to break him, Job's trials took a darker, more excruciating turn. What happens to a man when his body becomes a battleground, when pain overtakes him so completely that even the simplest act of sitting becomes unbearable? This was the next chapter in Job's suffering. Job's body was struck with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. These weren't mere rashes or blisters but open, festering wounds that oozed and burned. His skin became cracked and blackened. His breath grew foul, and his appearance so disfigured that even those who once knew him now turned away in disgust. Can you imagine the torment of being trapped in a body that feels like it's betraying you, a prison of relentless agony? Job's response was as raw as his pain. He took a piece of broken pottery, a shard of clay discarded as useless, and used it to scrape his sores, desperate for some semblance of relief. He sat in ashes, the universal sign of mourning and humility, his dignity stripped away along with his health. And then came a voice, not from heaven, but from the one person Job might have hoped to find solace in, his wife. Her words cut deeper than any physical wound. Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Imagine that. In the moment when Job needed comfort most, her words added to his pain. But Job, though battered and broken, responded with wisdom and restraint. You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God, and not trouble? Even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, Job refused to curse God. He acknowledged a truth that so many of us struggle to accept. Life is a mix of blessings and trials, and God's sovereignty doesn't waver based on our circumstances. But how much more could Job endure? His physical suffering was compounded by isolation. Those who once admired and respected him now avoided him, whispering rumors that his calamities must be the result of hidden sins. Job, once surrounded by friends, servants, and family, was now utterly alone. His cries of anguish filled the silence. Have you ever felt like your pain set you apart from the world? Like no one could truly understand what you were going through? That's where Job was, isolated in his misery, questioning not only his circumstances but the very reason for his existence. This stage of Job's story raises a piercing question. How do we endure when every part of us, body, mind, and soul, is under attack? Job's suffering was a test, yes, but it was also a mirror reflecting the human condition. Fragile, vulnerable, and desperate for answers. Yet, even as Job scraped his wounds and battled despair, his story wasn't over. The silence surrounding him would soon be broken by the arrival of 3 friends. But their words, meant to console, would only deepen Job's struggle. What happens when those we trust to lift us up instead weigh us down? That's the next chapter in this remarkable journey. Stay with me. As Job sat in the ashes, his body broken and his heart shattered, 3 figures appeared on the horizon. They were his friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. News of Job's calamities had reached them, and they came with a shared purpose, to console him in his unimaginable grief. At first, their reaction seemed fitting for the weight of Job's suffering. When they saw him from a distance, they could barely recognize him. His once strong and respected form was now frail, covered in sores, and surrounded by the silence of despair. The sight moved them to tears. They tore their own robes and sprinkled dust on their heads, a profound gesture of shared mourning and solidarity. And then they did something remarkable. For 7 days and 7 nights, they sat with Job in complete silence. 7 days. Not a word was spoken. Can you imagine the depth of their respect, the gravity of their acknowledgement of Job's pain? In this silence, they seemed to say, "Your suffering is too great for words. This is a moment worth reflecting on." In times of deep sorrow, words often fail. Perhaps you've experienced it, when someone you care about is in pain, and nothing you say seems adequate. Sometimes, presence alone is the greatest gift. And for those 7 days, their presence was exactly what Job needed. But silence doesn't last forever, does it? Eventually, Job broke the stillness. He poured out his anguish, lamenting the day of his birth and questioning why such suffering had been allowed to overtake him. It was a cry not of rebellion, but of raw, unfiltered pain. A man desperate for understanding in the face of overwhelming darkness. Hearing Job's lament, his friends began to speak. And it was here that their well-meaning intentions unraveled. Eliphaz was the first to break the silence. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who thought he understood God's ways. His message was simple. "Job, consider this suffering as discipline. Surely, no one suffers like this unless there's a reason. Seek God's favor, and your life will be restored." Then Bildad took his turn. His tone was harsher. He suggested that Job's children might have died because of their own sins and implied that Job himself must have strayed from righteousness. "If you were truly pure," Bildad reasoned, "God would already have delivered you." Zophar was the most blunt of the three. He accused Job of stubbornness and pride, insisting that Job must have committed great wrongs to deserve such punishment. He urged Job to repent and seek God's forgiveness, convinced that Job's misery was a direct result of his hidden sins. Can you imagine hearing these words in the depths of your pain? Job, already crushed under the weight of his losses, was now burdened by accusations from the very people he trusted. Their words, meant to heal, cut deeper than any wound. And yet, Job did not remain silent. He defended himself with unwavering resolve, asserting his innocence and integrity. He challenged their simplistic understanding of suffering and questioned their authority to speak on God's behalf. "Miserable comforters are you all," he declared, exposing their lack of empathy and wisdom. This exchange between Job and his friends reveals a profound truth about suffering. It is not always tied to sin, and its purpose is often beyond human understanding. How quick are we to judge others in their pain, assuming we know the reasons behind their struggles? Job's story forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding and the danger of speaking for God when we lack his wisdom. The conversations with his friends only deepened Job's isolation. Their inability to provide true comfort left him feeling even more alone. But in his defiance and his cries for justice, Job was drawing closer to a truth that would soon be revealed, not by men, but by the voice of God himself. What happens when human reasoning fails and divine wisdom steps in? That moment is coming. But first, we must journey deeper into Job's questions, his doubts, and his unshakable faith in the God he desperately sought to understand. Stay with me. The answers will come, and they may surprise you. The silence between Job and his friends had been broken, and now, the air crackled with tension. What began as an attempt at comfort quickly escalated into a heated debate. A battle of words that would test Job's patience, his faith, and his understanding of God's justice. Job's lament had been raw and heart-wrenching. He cursed the day of his birth, questioned why he was ever brought into a world of such suffering, and openly voiced his desire for God to end his misery. It was an honest cry from a broken man seeking meaning in the chaos. But instead of compassion, his friends offered criticism veiled as wisdom. Eliphaz, the eldest, spoke first. His words were measured, almost gentle, but their implication was clear. Job must have sinned. "Think about it, Job," Eliphaz said. "When have the innocent ever perished? Those who sow trouble reap it." He claimed to have received a vision, a divine revelation, that confirmed his belief. No human is pure before God. To Eliphaz, Job's suffering was a form of divine discipline. His advice: seek God's forgiveness and accept his correction. Job listened, but his response was sharp. He rejected Eliphaz's assumption that suffering was always the result of sin. With a voice full of anguish, he cried, "Teach me, and I will be silent. Show me where I have gone astray." Job wasn't claiming perfection, but he knew his heart. He knew his suffering couldn't be reduced to a simplistic equation of sin and punishment. Next, Bildad stepped in, his tone colder and more direct. "If your children sinned against him, they got what they deserved," Bildad declared. He then urged Job to seek God, insisting that if Job were truly pure, God would already have restored him. Bildad's words cut deep, not just because they were harsh, but because they implied that Job's children had perished due to their own wrongdoing. Job's grief turned to indignation. "How long will you torment me and crush me with words?" he asked. He defended his innocence once more, declaring that he had walked in integrity before God. Yet Job was honest about his confusion. Why does God allow the wicked to prosper while the righteous suffer? Where is the justice in that? The third friend, Zophar, delivered the harshest blow. He accused Job of being prideful and blind to his own guilt. "Know this, Job," Zophar said. "God has even forgotten some of your sin." In Zophar's mind, Job deserved worse than he was getting. A claim that left Job stunned. The debates spiraled on, each friend speaking in turn, only for Job to counter their accusations with fierce resolve. Over and over, they argued that Job's suffering must be the result of hidden sin. They clung to a rigid view of God's justice. Blessings for the righteous, curses for the wicked. But Job's suffering defied their logic, and they refused to see it. Job, for his part, grew bolder with each exchange. He openly challenged their theology and their presumptions about God. "You smear me with lies. You are worthless physicians, all of you," Job declared. He reminded them that their words were not inspired by divine insight but by their own limited understanding. But Job didn't stop at rebuking his friends. He turned his frustration toward heaven, crying out to God for answers. "Oh, that I might have my case heard before God himself," Job pleaded. He longed for an audience with his Creator, not to accuse but to understand. Job knew he was innocent and could not reconcile his suffering with the justice of a God he had always trusted. Amid his despair, Job made one of the most remarkable declarations of faith in the entire Bible. "Though he slay me, yet I will hope in him." Here was a man clinging to faith even as his world crumbled. Job's friends might have misjudged him, but Job knew that his life, his suffering, and his questions could only be answered by the one who had given him life. This debate wasn't just about Job and his friends. It was a reflection of humanity's struggle to understand suffering. Why do the innocent suffer? Why does evil seem to flourish unchecked? And where is God in the midst of it all? Job's questions echo through the ages, resonating with anyone who has ever faced loss, injustice, or inexplicable pain. And yet, the answers Job sought would not come from his friends. They would come from the voice of God himself, a voice that would soon break through the whirlwind. But before we get there, Job's defiance and his faith must be tested further. His cries for justice and understanding would rise to heaven, and the response he would receive would shake him and us to the core. Stay with me as we delve deeper into this timeless story of faith, doubt, and divine revelation. As the debate with his friends raged on, Job found himself standing more and more alone. The weight of their accusations, combined with his own relentless suffering, left him in a place of profound despair. Yet, it was in this despair that Job's voice grew louder, not in rebellion, but in a desperate search for meaning. He began to question everything. Why was he suffering so greatly if he had lived righteously? Why did the wicked seem to prosper while the innocent endured unimaginable pain? Where was the justice of God he had trusted in his entire life? Job's lament wasn't just a cry of anguish. It was an unflinching confrontation with the mysteries of existence. Why does God give life to those in misery? Job asked, his voice trembling with sorrow. Why is light given to those who long for death, but it does not come? The questions weren't rhetorical. Job genuinely wanted answers. He felt abandoned by the very God he had served so faithfully. If I have sinned, what have I done to you, O watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your target? Have I become a burden to you? These words were not the defiance of a man rejecting God. They were the heartfelt cries of someone yearning for clarity in the darkness. Job was searching for the God he knew, the God of justice, mercy, and truth. Job's longing for an audience with God became a central theme in his lament. He envisioned a courtroom where he could plead his case before the Almighty, where he could present his life and ask why he had been made to endure such agony. "Oh, that I knew where I might find him," Job cried. "I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and consider what he would say." In his heart, Job believed that if he could just hear from God directly, the answers would come. He held on to the hope that God's justice, though hidden, would ultimately prevail. But even as he sought answers, Job's faith flickered like a flame in the wind. He felt the sting of silence. God seemed distant, unreachable, and indifferent to his suffering. It was a feeling that many who endure hardship can relate to, the sense of crying out into a void and hearing nothing in return. Yet, amidst this silence, Job made a declaration that revealed the depth of his faith. "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." These words were a spark of hope in the darkness. Job believed that even if his earthly suffering went unanswered, there was a future where God's justice would be revealed, where he would stand before his Creator and see him face to face. Still, Job's questions remained unresolved. He asked why God seemed to turn a blind eye to injustice in the world. Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? Job asked. They see their children established around them. Their homes are safe and free from fear, and yet they say to God, "Leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways." This apparent contradiction gnawed at Job. It seemed to upend everything he believed about the moral order of the universe. Yet, he refused to give up on the idea of divine justice, even as he struggled to understand it. His cries culminated in a bold challenge. "Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would present it to him as to a ruler." Here was a man unbroken in his pursuit of truth. Though battered and bruised, Job held on to the belief that God's justice and presence would one day be revealed. He refused to accept easy answers or the flawed reasoning of his friends. Instead, he demanded a direct encounter with the Creator. And it's here, in this tension, that the story reaches a critical turning point. Job's questions hang in the air, unanswered but not ignored. His cries echo through the ages, capturing the universal human struggle to understand pain, purpose, and the presence of God in the midst of suffering. But soon the silence would break. A whirlwind would descend, and the voice of the Almighty would finally respond. What would God say to a man who had lost everything yet refused to let go of his faith? What answers would he provide to the questions that haunt us all? Stay with me as we step into the storm, where the Creator of the universe speaks directly to his creation. The silence that had haunted Job for so long was finally shattered. Just as Job had hoped for an audience with God, the Almighty spoke, though not in the way Job expected. There was no soft, comforting voice offering easy answers. No gentle whisper reassuring him that everything would be okay. Instead, there was a whirlwind, a fierce and powerful force that swept through the skies, a manifestation of God's glory and might. From the heart of the storm, God's voice boomed. It was not a voice of condemnation or anger, but of authority and sovereignty. An invitation to see the world through his eyes, a perspective far beyond human comprehension. "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" God asked. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. These words were a call to Job, and to all of humanity, to recognize the vast difference between the Creator and the created. God's challenge was not an accusation. It was a reminder of the limits of human understanding in the face of divine wisdom. God began to question Job, not with anger, but with a sense of awe-inspiring wonder at the universe he had made. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? God's words were not meant to belittle Job, but to show him the grandeur and complexity of the creation that Job had only seen in part. Job had lived his life in a world full of mystery, but God, in his infinite wisdom, was the one who had set it all into motion. What is the way to the abode of light? God continued. And where does darkness reside? Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwellings? God's questions continued to reveal the unfathomable depth of his knowledge, how he controls not only the physical world but the very forces of nature, the stars in the sky, and the creatures that inhabit the earth. From the majestic behemoth to the terrifying Leviathan, God painted a picture of the awe-inspiring creatures he had created, each one a testament to his power and wisdom. Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you make a pet of it like a bird or put it on a leash for the young women of your house? These images of creatures so vast, so untamable, reminded Job of his own smallness in the grand scheme of things. Through all of this, God was not condemning Job's questions or suffering. He was inviting Job and all of us to step back and see the bigger picture, to acknowledge that there is a wisdom far greater than our own. God's ways, his purposes, are often hidden from our view, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. The world is governed by laws and order that we can't always understand, but we can trust that they are rooted in his perfect wisdom. As God spoke, Job realized the depth of his own limitations. He had questioned God's justice, but now he was faced with a revelation of God's infinite power, knowledge, and purpose. And in that moment, Job understood that his suffering, though deep and painful, was a part of a much larger story. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, Job confessed. Things too wonderful for me to know. In that humbling moment, Job's pride fell away. He had demanded answers, but now he saw that some answers were beyond his reach. What mattered now was the recognition of God's sovereignty and the trust that he alone understood the full scope of what was happening. Job knew he was not in control, but he didn't need to be. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted, Job declared, acknowledging the power of the God who had created the heavens and the earth. In this powerful encounter, Job's perspective shifted. The questions that had tormented him were now framed in the context of a universe governed by a wise and sovereign God. Job's suffering did not go unnoticed, but it was no longer about demanding an explanation. It was about trusting that God's plans were ultimately good, even when they didn't make sense in the moment. And in that moment of repentance and understanding, Job's heart was healed. He no longer needed to grasp for answers. He had come face to face with the one who holds all the answers. This was the moment of transformation for Job. He had been broken, but now he was restored, not because his suffering had been taken away, but because his understanding of who God is had been renewed. As Job's story reveals, sometimes the answers to our deepest questions don't come in the way we expect. But when we encounter God, not as a figure we can control, but as the creator of the universe, we begin to see our own struggles in a different light. And soon, God would restore Job's fortunes, double what he had before, but the real restoration had already begun in his heart. Job's faith, his relationship with God, was stronger than ever. The whirlwind had not only revealed God's power, it had deepened Job's trust in him. God is sovereign, and his wisdom surpasses all understanding. And sometimes, it's in the silence, in the waiting, and in the questions that we learn the most about who he is. As we reflect on the story of Job, we are left with more than just a tale of tragedy and restoration. It's a story that calls us to confront the very nature of our own suffering, our questions, and the way we see the world. Job's journey is not just his alone. It's a journey that resonates with each of us. In different seasons of life, when we find ourselves asking why, when we face the trials that seem unbearable. What can we learn from Job's experience? What lessons can we take into our own lives, especially when we find ourselves overwhelmed by the weight of hardship? There are several profound truths we can draw from Job's story. Truths that speak directly to the heart of every believer who faces their own moments of questioning. 1. Faith even in the darkest moments. Job's unwavering faith, even in the darkest moments of his life, is perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. Despite the loss of his wealth, his health, and his family, Job did not abandon his faith in God. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. He said, "May the name of the Lord be praised." In the midst of agony, Job's heart still clung to the truth that God was worthy of praise, not because of what he gave, but because of who he was. In times of suffering, it can feel as though God is distant or even absent. But Job's example reminds us that our faith does not depend on our circumstances. True faith acknowledges the sovereignty of God, even when we can't understand what he is doing. When life feels like a storm, and we feel like we're caught in the tempest, it's faith in God that anchors us, reminding us that he is with us through it all. 2. The sovereignty of God. One of the key revelations in Job's story is the overwhelming truth of God's sovereignty. God is the creator, the one who orders the universe, and nothing is beyond his control. Job's questioning of God, his search for answers, was met with a divine response that challenged him to recognize the vast difference between the creator and the created. This lesson is not just for Job, it's for us too. We often want answers, we want to understand why things happen the way they do. But the truth is, we don't always have the capacity to grasp the full scope of God's plans. His wisdom far exceeds our understanding. And in our suffering, we can take comfort in knowing that the God who created the heavens and the earth also sees our pain, holds our tears, and works all things for his purpose, even when we don't see the outcome. 3. The value of humility. Job's story also teaches us the importance of humility in our relationship with God. Though Job was a man of great integrity and righteousness, when he encountered the greatness of God, he realized how small he was in comparison. "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted," Job declared. He humbled himself before God, acknowledging his limitations and lack of understanding. In our own lives, it's easy to let pride take root when we don't understand the reasons for our struggles. But Job's example shows us the power of humble submission before God. When we admit that we don't have all the answers, when we let go of the need to control, we make room for God's presence and peace to enter our hearts. 4. The importance of true friendship. While Job's friends initially sat with him in silence, offering their companionship, their subsequent words did more harm than good. They mistakenly assumed Job's suffering was a result of his own sin and tried to offer explanations that only deepened his pain. This serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of offering genuine support to those who are suffering. In times of hardship, what we need most is not quick answers or judgment, but the presence of true friends, those who will walk beside us, listen without condemnation, and offer the comfort of empathy, not theory. It's easy to fall into the trap of trying to fix someone's pain, but sometimes the best way to help is simply to sit in silence, to be present, and to remind them that they are not alone. 5. The mystery of God's plans. Ultimately, Job's story calls us to trust in the mystery of God's plans. Job never received the answers he wanted about why he suffered. Instead, he was reminded that God's ways are far beyond human comprehension. His suffering had a purpose, though Job couldn't see it at the time. The same is true for us. Our lives are part of a grander story, and though we may not always understand why we face certain trials, we can trust that God's purposes are good, and he is working all things for his glory and our ultimate good. Job's restoration at the end of the book serves as a reminder that while suffering may be temporary, God's redemption is eternal. Through our trials, we are shaped, refined, and made more into the image of Christ. And just as Job experienced the blessings of restoration, we too can trust that God will make all things right in the end. 6. Hope beyond suffering. Finally, the story of Job is a story of hope. Though Job endured intense suffering, in the end he was restored. God blessed him with more than he had before, giving him a new family and even greater wealth. But the true restoration was not just in his possessions or his health. It was in his renewed relationship with God. Job's faith was deeper than ever, and he had gained a new understanding of God's nature. In our own lives, we can take heart knowing that God does not waste our pain. He sees us, he understands our struggles, and he promises to bring healing and restoration, not just in this life, but in eternity. There is hope beyond our suffering, a hope rooted in the promises of a faithful God who will never leave us or forsake us. In conclusion, Job's story offers timeless lessons for all who face suffering, confusion, or uncertainty. It calls us to trust in God's sovereignty, to humble ourselves before him, to seek true friendship, and to recognize the mystery of his plans. It reminds us that our pain is not without purpose, and that there is hope beyond our suffering. Job's journey may have been filled with trials, but it ended in a profound revelation of God's goodness, mercy, and faithfulness. And as we walk through our own struggles, we too can hold on to the same truths that Job discovered. God is sovereign, he is faithful, and his plans for us are filled with hope and redemption.